Kia ora. Welcome to our next conversation at CARE on free speech, censorship, and the role of media within the digital context today. Welcome to our global audience that is also watching on live stream. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. David Shanks to CARE. Mr. Shanks is the Chief Censor, Office of Film and Literature Classification in New Zealand. David is a senior public servant who has played key roles in developing policy and implementation solutions within the broader context of education, health, and well-being. You know, what was really powerful about your introduction is the wide variety of backgrounds that you bring together, all within the context of the broader questions of health and well-being. Before stepping into his role as Chief Censor, David was Director, Health, Safety and Security at the New Zealand Ministry of Education. He also served as the Deputy Chief Executive and Chief Legal Advisor for the Ministry of Social Development. Most recently, David was in the news for his role in banning the Christchurch terror manifesto. Questions of censorship in areas such as violence, sex and pornography have critical implications for population health and well-being, particularly so within the context of the rapidly changing digital landscape we are living amidst. How these questions are balanced with concerns for free speech, questions of power, questions of abuse of power are increasingly critical in a globally transforming digital media landscape. It is therefore really pertinent that we have David with us, especially so, as I was sharing with him, that New Zealand is emerging as a global model for looking at how you regulate the media environment. Welcome, David.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Ruahine tōku maunga. Ko Tuki Tuki tōku awa. Ko Kotarana tōku iwi. Ko Shanks tōku hapu. Ko David tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora all, I'm David Shanks. Thank you, Professor Mohan. Thank you, Dr. Steve Ellers, for the invitation here to speak to you today. As you've just heard, I'm the Chief Censor for New Zealand. It's great to be here at the Massey University campus. I've got a connection with Palmerston North from back in the day when I actually had my first real job as a lawyer was for a local firm back in the early 90s. I didn't really anticipate then that at some point in the future I'd be addressing an audience at Massey University as Chief Censor. I guess at that time I didn't see censorship as a particularly desirable or fruitful career option or path for me. But here I am, and interestingly right now I think issues around media regulation, classification, consumer information, and the balance between freedom and freedom of expression and protection of harm and management of what we're seeing as media amplification of harms is an increasingly important global conversation, and it's certainly issues that are occupying me and my staff every day. And I'd like to just take an opportunity to give you a bit of an overview of what we do, our framework, how we think about things, and some recent challenges. And I'll look to provide good scope at the end of this for some comments and questions and feedback, because we're learning all the time. It's not as if we have the definitive answers here. There are no definitive answers. There are choices and shades of grey. So feedback and discussions with groups such as yourself are critical in terms of our learning and process. But just to touch on a bit of a high-level issue in this space, thinking about things as a media regulator, increasingly I think one of the big challenges we have is the speed and pace of change. So and I like to take anthropological views of these things. I think of us as a unique and fascinating species with a set of unique and fascinating characteristics. And one of our defining characteristics is our ability to innovate and use technology to transform ourselves and our environment. And that's ever increasing, right? So looking back over history, our ancestors developed stone tools, shaped hand axes, great innovation, very powerful. It took 2.5 million years to figure out how to put a handle on that stone axe and thereby gather the massive leverage and power multiplication factors that could come from that. 2.5 million years, takes a while for social codes, practices, standards, habits, cultural norms to catch up. But in contrast, we've had the internet for only about 10,000 days. And that's the internet. We've had smartphones and devices like that for probably around about 4,000 days or less. So it's about pace and managing to work out the advantages of technologies and manage some of the downsides. And as our technologies get more and more powerful, the importance of keeping pace and adjusting our approaches and making sure we've got the right sort of responses, I think, become ever more important. And I was addressing a group in Sydney a couple of weeks ago. Essentially, it was an e-safety conference looking at pathways and information about indicators of online harms. So, child sexual abuse material, self-harm videos, suicide content, those kinds of things, right? And at the end of the conference, I was on a panel which was supposed to be a light-hearted, happy, future-looking panel, and I brought everyone down, basically, because I said, look, has anyone besides me noticed that whenever we've got a time series in terms of tracking the extent of a harm, like the amount of child sex abuse material, for example, or the amount of self-harm videos, has anyone noticed, like me, in the course of this conference, that all the trends are going up? Everything is going up. Everything is getting worse. Nothing is getting better. And part of what we were doing was looking forward, what comes next. And I said, look, to see what comes next, sometimes you have to look back. You have to learn from the past. And I'm increasingly inclined to look back to about 1870, when the Industrial Revolution was really kicking off properly, and coal was being extracted at industrial quantities, and of course then the oil and gas industry ramped up from there, making massive profits, huge dynasties, and fueling progress in commerce and transport for sure. But now, fast forward to today, we've got 2 trillion tonnes of CO2 in the atmosphere, and no one really knows what to do about it. And we're still hooked on that industry, right? And increasingly, I start drawing parallels between that kind of industrial exploitation and what we have now as a digital industrial complex exploiting a whole new resource, which is us, our data, our information, our behaviours, our communications, our attention, with big dynasties being created, massive profits being generated, and a digital exhaust being vented onto the internet, which doesn't decay, and no one has any clear ideas of what the implication of that might be in 5 or 10 or 50 years' time. Kind of feels like there's some parallels there that we might be able to learn from in terms of thinking about what's a sustainable model right now, which is a big challenge, but I think something we should be thinking about now. So why have sensors? Well, maybe some of what I've just been talking about might provide some insight into how I think about that, which is management of technology and our information platforms for the good of all, and having processes in place to manage the downsides, because there's always a downside to every technology. This is a statement that we generated in our office quite recently, stepping back from what we do and how we do it and how we think about things. And you'll see it's about protection. It's about protection of New Zealanders, And it's about empowerment as well. It's about information to get good choices, and it's upholding freedom of expression. And that is a core value in everything we do. Every choice we make is always informed by the fact that what we're doing is actually inherently often detracting from rights of access to information and the rights of freedom of information. So you need to take real care about those choices. And here's the Act which we use to kind of frame up our thinking around that. The very sexily titled Films, Videos and Publications Classification Act 1993. Now this is a great piece of legislation, folks. This actually distills down some state-of-the-art late 80s thinking about how you develop the balance between protection of harm and expression of freedom. And I'm kind of joking about because, but it's kind of true. There's some very good thinking in this Act, addressing essentially the point that if you're going to take away anyone's freedom of expression or right of access to information, you've got to have a damn good reason for that, and that reason should be protection from actual harm, not ick factor, not like this is just yuck and we don't want to have it around. And it's not because it's uncomfortable or we're unhappy with it, and it sure as hell can't be because this puts the state in a bad light. So our framework basically has an independent office that's, I'm appointed by government, but I'm not accountable to any minister. And I'm authorised, like the Privacy Commissioner or the Children's Commissioner, to be a bit of a watchdog and to make sure that censorship is not applied for the benefit of the state, as you have in countries such as China or North Korea or other states that I could name. So that's a critical part and factor of our system, which I think is really valuable. But there is a problem with it. Of course, the other great thing about this Act is it needs to be read in conjunction with the Bill of Rights Act, which of course enshrines our freedoms. You can't detract from freedom of expression without, as I say, good reason, and that reason is protection from harm in some substantive way. But as much as I love our Act, and it's got such a great title, it is 1993 legislation, right? So this is what this guy looked like in 1993. And in 1993, the World Wide Web, it was about 1993 or 1994 that the World Wide Web was first put onto public access domain by scientists at CERN. So my Act is basically pre-internet, right? So, and that's got some problems in today's day and age, as you can imagine. It envisages that we have physical kind of media that we actually sticky labels on and things like that, which is increasingly no longer the case. But there's some really good aspects about it. And one of the great aspects about it is essentially any publication can be classified under this Act. And a publication is very broadly defined. It can mean a film, a DVD, a video game, or a book, the sorts of usual things that would come to mind when you think about a publication. But it can also mean a t-shirt or a drink can. And I've actually personally classified a camper van. I was at an international conference a couple of years ago, and the German classification authority just kept on asking me over dinner, "You classified a camper van? We're missing something in translation." No, it's a camper van. It's got art on it that promoted the use of Class A drugs. It's classifiable. But the key thing really, beyond those sorts of outliers, is that a publication can mean an electronic file, any electronic file. So that's key. So when you think about what we do, we've got a proactive, the Act sets up a proactive classification regime where kind of cinematic films that are released are automatically classified by my office if they're not cross-rated against Australian and UK ratings. DVDs and physical media games are classified by my office as well. And we have reactive content that comes into us. So this is what we call Crown work. So this is law enforcement work that is referred to us by the likes of police, internal affairs, digital safety unit, customs, and the like. And that's kind of dark end material, child sex abuse material, extreme graphic violence, and terrorist promotional material that I'll be talking about in a minute. So there's proactive, reactive. There's also a call-in power that I have as Chief Censor. So I can call in any publication, which means any digital file, which means anything on the internet. So with a staff of less than 20 people, what do you do with a power like that if you can call in actually theoretically anything that exists on the net? Well, I tend to use it judiciously, and I tend to use it when people are raising specific complaints or issues or real substantive matters of concern with me. But that's there. I'll quickly go through some examples thinking about our traditional classification approach and some trends in that space. A Star is Born. Who's seen A Star is Born? A few of you, handful. It's quite a good movie. It's the spoiler alert, it has a suicide in it as a kind of key fulcrum plot device at the end. And it seems strange to say that that's a spoiler alert because this is actually a remake of a remake of a remake, this film. It's been remade, this is the 4th time round, I think. But still, it's spread over a long period of time, and one of the issues about this film was it was cross-rated against the Australian Classification Authority with references to sex scenes and language, I think. And we were notified by victim support in Auckland, who actually responded and helped out 2 young women who went out to the movies for the first time in some time because they had been mourning the loss of their mother through suicide, and they decided to get out of the house and see a film to kind of just get back into the swing of things. They had no idea that suicide was a feature of this film, and they had no idea that the method kind of referenced in this film very strongly was the same method used by their mother. So they were extremely impacted by that. And one of the things that we picked up and took from that is, oh, well, there should have been a warning for that in this film. And we're very, I think we're quite a progressive authority in the world in terms of identifying suicide content and just saying, hey, look, it's reasonable that the audience gets some kind of warning that there's this sort of content in a film, because we've got a vulnerable population out there. We have the highest rates of youth suicide in the OECD, and we liaise very closely with the Mental Health Foundation, and we are increasingly in the information flows where they're getting contacted by people who are impacted seriously and significantly by media, sometimes by surprise, right? So a key thing about our work here, and this is just a graph showing kind of the number of publications that we have chosen to include a suicide warning on since we kind of started back in the mid-2000s. And there's a couple of factors going on here. One is we're more alert and attuned and likely to warn for suicide content. The other is there's just more content that features this as a plot device, I think. We haven't done a quantitative study around that, but just in terms of what we're seeing, it's increasingly used as a device to create an emotional response or a plot pivot point in commercial product. It just is. And this is a show that some of you might recognise, 13 Reasons Why. There's been quite a lot of publicity around this show over the last couple of years. And significant international attention, right, talking about the potential implications of suicide depictions and the effects of media generally on audiences, right? So this is a show where we actually created a new rating, an RP18 rating, warning for, this is the second series, warning for rape, suicide themes, drug use and bullying. The RP18 means that basically young people, young teens can view it, but they should be really viewing it with a parental guardian, And some of our advice around that was, look, we know that your teen might not want to actually be watching it with you, but you as a parent or guardian should be aware that they're watching this show, and you should watch it yourself and try and connect with them about it. Just trying to take a practical approach, given that we knew giving this an R18 and trying to pretend that teenagers wouldn't watch it was completely hopeless, because the characters in this show are 16 years old. It's being marketed very aggressively on social media and other platforms to mid-teens. And I've literally stood in front of hundreds of 16-year-old media students and informally surveyed them about how many of them had seen this show. It was 95% plus. All of them had seen it. So Netflix doesn't release viewership numbers, but we know this was a huge hit for various reasons. And so what? So what, right? There was a bit of a debate about, actually it's a good thing to open up the discussion around suicide. Maybe the effect of a show like this could be net positive in terms of allowing people that might be feeling suicidal or having problems. This could be an opportunity for a discussion. That was one of the discussions at the time when the first series came out. Our response to that was, there could be some potential for that, but you still got to warn people properly and clearly about it. And you've got to give parents and guardians an opportunity to understand that this show actually shows very graphic instructional methods of suicide. And the other thing is, this show can make suicide feel like just a logical consequence of a bunch of things happening in your life. This is just where it gets to. And there's other problematic aspects besides, but the bottom line is, in terms of the impact and the current research, the numbers out of the US just got released a couple of months ago, and they were very concerning. They showed a spike in suicide in young people immediately following the broadcast of the first season of 13 Reasons Why. There's about 3 different studies. One study showed about a 19% increase in, I think it was female suicides over a 14 to 17 age range, somewhere in that range. So again, correlation. Can't establish that a TV show had this immediate effect, but worrying. And when you've got the American Medical Association editorial kind of talking about broad population effects of media such as this, the media effects are not strong. Watching a show alone is not going to cause someone to commit suicide, but over a broad population base with people that are vulnerable, it's reasonable to assume it can have an impact, and potentially a significant one. So that tells us we need to pay attention and think about how we can manage some of those harms, and at least give people the right sort of information and warning. I'll whip through this really. This is talking about the fact that actually not all ratings are the same. Different population bases have different concerns and will warn for different things. And as I've said, we'll warn for suicide probably before many other authorities in the world. But lots of other authorities will warn for bad language way before we will. Or, we'll have a show, this is a show called The Perfection, which essentially had characters that were training as high-level world performers, musicians, and essentially they were part of a school that turns out to be a rape school, so they're raped if they get things wrong in their lessons. So quite disturbing sexual violence themes, but the warnings internationally were for language and violence and nudity is the top one. This is what Netflix warned on this show when they first put it up for New Zealand consumers. This MA15 rating is an Australian rating, which is a bit of an interesting one. I'll explain why it's so long, but I'm not quite sure what strong nudity is, but they thought that was worth warning for. But there's nothing about sexual violence in there, right? The third one is the UK warning, and the final one is the warning that we put on that show after we reviewed it. So we see really big differential approaches, particularly with a North American approach that is really strong on warning for language. If there's bad language, they'll put that front and centre first all the time. I struggle with that. When there's rape and suicide and that sort of content in the show, I'm not particularly worried about language or nudity for that matter. And one of the reasons why we're reasonably comfortable and confident in our approach about making some of those differentiations is because we reach out and talk to people, and in particular we do research engaging with young people to see actually what they think and what they think they should be warned about. And this is a study we did a few years ago looking at young New Zealanders and their consumption of material streamed or online or on broadcast TV or at the movie theatres which contained sexual violence. And we got some great comments from this largely qualitative study which told us a few things. One thing is kids are saying, nobody knows what we're looking at. We're looking at our stuff on our phones and our devices in our time. Our parents don't know. Nobody knows. And we don't actually talk even amongst ourselves that much about some of the stuff that we see. And because we watch anything we like, it'd be good to know what's coming up, because often we're just free-ranging out there consuming content and we're hit with stuff that we don't see coming. Give us more information so that we can have a chance and we can make some informed choices. And this was commercial content, this study, but themes about kind of extreme dark-end depictions of beheadings and killings and violence online definitely came through in that study as well. And that's a factor. So, stepping back as a media regulator, looking at the current state, looking at internet content, looking at what we have in place in this country and in common with most international authorities, we've got basically a patchwork quilt of regulators who address particular areas that largely reflect a late 80s view of what media is. So we've got a Broadcasting Standards Authority looking after broadcast and TV. We've got ourselves looking after cinematic release and DVDs. We've got Advertising Standards Authority, Media Council, NetSafe, who deal with kind of one-on-one media harms and bullying. But the vast swathe of internet content is not monitored, it's not regulated, and it's going up at the rate of 500 hours a minute when you're talking about YouTube content. So that's a challenge. It's a digital content volume challenge. I'll just really quickly go through this, but essentially digital content challenges lend themselves to digital solutions in our view. So we're looking at a policy move that will mean that there's an expectation on streaming services, for example, to provide New Zealand consumers with New Zealand suitable classifications and warn for suicide, emphasise warnings for sexual violence and the like. And we're developing a tool that could help providers do that. And we know from international work and studies that can work. That can manage user-generated content as well, potentially. And that can help also with the vast amount of content involved around online gaming, which is a massive media area, of course. Just on gaming, there's some specific issues and harms in that area that are occupying our time. These are a couple of shots from a game called Rape Day that some of you might have heard about. It was reported on a little while ago. This was a rape game, basically. And that was the whole functionality of the game. We actually spoke to industry platforms to make sure that they didn't provide that to New Zealand consumers. And there's a bit of a worldwide backlash going, actually, that's going too far. So that didn't go very far. But we've seen other issues around gambling type functionality that's built to be really quite compulsive, that we're doing quite a lot of thinking about as well. And we're seeing kind of over-classification in some areas as well, where some games classification systems will just put an R18 on anything that has any kind of action or bad language, which we think is just as bad as kind of not classifying or under-classifying. And this is a problem because media technologies like gaming is just getting started, in my view. There's no, we've got a real challenge right now, but when you're talking about VR and AR type gaming functionality, the potential impacts and compulsive nature of some of these games is only going to keep getting more intense. And it's going to be great. We're going to talk about hugely entertaining and engaging games for sure, but potentially problematically compulsive, potentially addictive. I don't like using the word addiction in this context too often because it's got a whole clinical set of rationale and criteria attached to it. But really we're talking about things that can be potentially a problem in terms of people's mental health. And pornography, of course, is one industry that has absolutely kept pace with technology, in fact drives technology. And that's an area where we've done some thinking and research as well. Just to comment about the nature of the industry, it's mind-bogglingly huge, right? We all know pornography is one of the most popular consumed categories of content on the internet, but for one site, Pornhub, they're reporting 28.5 billion visits last year. There's 7.7 billion people in the world. Significant number of people aren't connected to the internet. So and that's one site. There's 500,000 commercial porn sites on the internet. So the numbers are huge. And New Zealand's quite an enthusiastic consumer per capita, by the way, in terms of visits to this particular website anyway. And again, technology is pushing the bar constantly in that sort of industry. We've got deepfake porn emerging where child actress faces can be transplanted onto porn actresses' bodies, creating a kind of a hybrid child sexual abuse material. Fortnite porn was one of the biggest trends in porn searches last year. So that tends to indicate there's content being produced in relation to demand. When you're talking about animated content, I can't help but think that's indicating that this industry is increasingly reaching out to young people and children, which we know is the case because we've done some research in this area. And our study actually involved 2,300 14 to 17-year-olds in this country last year. It was quite an extensive survey. And in fact, that represented nearly 1% of the entire cadre in this country. So, a significant study internationally and up to date. And that showed us that about 1 in 4 kids are exposed to adult pornography, and our definition of pornography was fairly graphic. And 1 in 4 young New Zealanders had seen porn before the age of 12, and mostly they weren't looking for it when they first saw it, was what they told us. And the sorts of content that they saw was problematic. Lots were seeing violence or aggression in pornography and non-consensual activity. But I'll move on from pornography and just talk a bit about recent events and online extremism for a minute. So I've gone on the record saying that following March the 15th and the attacks and the broadcast really through multiple social media platforms of the live stream video, that felt to me like it might be one of the worst media harms ever inflicted on a national population. And that created a little bit of a stir, and some people were pushing back going, that's hyperbole, but other people have said, yeah, but what's the counterfactual? What's a worse case? And the fact remains right now, we actually don't know how many people in this country saw that video. We just know a lot did, right? In the immediate aftermath, I was on the phone talking to someone about the work that we had in Train in terms of classifying the live stream video and the manifesto. And I arrived at my destination, and the cab driver got out and he shook my hand and he said, "Look, thank you for anything you can do to take this, off the internet and away. My child saw this. He saw this video. What do I say to him? This is a terrible thing." And I ended up starting to just start informally polling cab drivers and Uber drivers that I was using to get around in the immediate following week. And 8 out of 10 of those drivers had seen the video. And of those 8, I think half of them at least, their children had seen the video. So I've also been in a room of Crown chief executives and asked them the same question: who saw the live stream video? None of them had. So I started immediately going, okay, so there's demographic, socioeconomic disparities here about who saw this, who basically self-censored or went, I know I shouldn't be watching this, who felt the need to watch it because this was a threat that they needed to understand. But we don't know. We don't know who's seen it. We don't know the details about the demographics. We don't know how many children saw it, although we do know that there were children lying on the floor in lockdown in Christchurch, wondering what on earth was going on and going on their phones and watching a live stream video. We know that was happening. So it's a massively harmful event, right, in terms of impacts on a population. In terms of our classification approach, we kind of had a framework for dealing with this sort of material because we had dealt with terrorist promotional material before, mostly in the area of Muslim extremism and ISIL material. So when we are looking at terrorist promotional material, we are looking for branding and promotion, right? So, and we've had to think very hard about that because we've also been sent what I call torture kill videos from places like Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, which are incredibly they're terrible things to view. I personally find it the hardest type of material to view and classify. But you know what? If it's not branded and if it's not promotional and if it's just a record of events, sometimes that can have value. Sometimes it's really hard to tell what sort of value it has, but it might have value in terms of denunciation of what it's portraying, in terms of criminal evidence. It might be the last record someone has of a loved one who was killed. And we need to weigh in all of those sorts of factors when we're looking at real life records of horror and cruelty. But when someone is killing someone and they're waving an ISIL flag or they're branding it in the cause of a terrorist promotional nature, they're essentially saying, this is what we do, this is what we believe in, this is what we do, and if you're one of us, you should do this too. And when it came to the live stream video, we saw all those hallmarks. The branded weapons, the white supremacist linked music, the call out to followers, the whole orchestration around it was promotional. So we had no difficulty in making that an objectionable publication. But it was clearly in a different category to what we had dealt with before in terms of this was in our home, this was affecting our countrymen, women, children. So that was certainly an issue. In terms of the manifesto, we knew it was going to be controversial banning that document. And in fact, when I first looked at that document, I kind of went, oh yeah, I don't think this is going to meet the bar for an objectionable publication, just on a quick glance and a scan. But when we sat down to classify it and worked it through and applied the same criteria that we had to ISIL promotional terrorist publications and magazines, it had all the same hallmarks. It exhorted its followers to kill. It described, at a high level, but it described means and targets. It described the rationalizations for killing women and children, and on and on. It stepped through all the same boxes and frames that we had seen in other terrorist promotional material. And one of the things that I said publicly following our decision in this space was, you know, this won't harm most people in terms of the so-called manifesto, the Great Replacement document. This would not harm most people who read it. It's not for most people. It wasn't written for people to read to understand the rationale for the attack or anything of that kind. It was written for a very small and very select audience. It was written for those people who were on the edge. It was written specifically to exhort people to copy these actions. And it was very, very personally saddening to me to read the document produced by the attacker in Poway, north of San Diego, who attacked a synagogue, who produced his own document following the same kind of template and frame as the Great Replacement document, and saying how impressed, basically, they were with that document and the reasons provided for carrying out a racially motivated attack. And this is slightly out of date because, of course, we had the El Paso attack subsequent to that, which essentially had all of the same hallmarks. And look, we couldn't prevent the Great Replacement being distributed internationally. All we could do was look at what we could do to try and do our best to protect this population and to apply the framework and rules that we have about prevention of promotion of terrorism, which is what we did. And that's not perfect, but it's something, and it is very hard now to find the live stream video and even the Great Replacement document online from here in New Zealand. And if anyone does seek out those documents, everyone's pretty clear that what they're doing is illegal. These are illegal, objectionable publications under our law. I'll whip through these next few slides because I'm keen to have a few some questions, but clearly this took internet platforms by surprise. This was, even Google calls the distribution and virality of the attack material as unprecedented. And I think transnational and government and industry collaborations such as the Christchurch Call represents is definitely the way forward, because these are global issues. You know, we can't address these in terms of just changing national regulation or making steps within national borders. It's bigger than that. And again, technology is going to keep pushing the boundaries. This is a 3D printed gun. What's the legality of owning the code that allows you to create a gun using a 3D printer? I really don't know. I've been giving it some thought, but these are going to be issues that are not going to go away. In ways forward, I think, folks, we're looking at what is effectively an uncontrolled experiment being run according to commercial imperatives that we didn't design. But it's running, the experiment's running, and I think we need to realise that that's what's happening and to do what we can to keep pace with it. And when I think about these sorts of challenges, I tend to think everyone goes immediately to regulation and changing the laws. I have a kind of a 10, 20, 70 rule of thumb that I apply to thinking about that, which is when you're looking in the round about the impacts that you can make in the system, about 10% of the impact is probably generated out of regulation. 20% is out of providing tools and information and material to young people and and parents and the community more broadly, and 70%, roughly speaking, is the change that you can generate out of education. And I'm quite persuaded by the Swedish model here, where the analogous organisation to the one that I lead in Sweden has been producing material for the Swedish education system for more than 10 years, producing stuff like, this is propaganda. This is propaganda. You're going to be subject to propaganda in your life. This is what it is. This is how it manipulates and shapes your opinions. This is how you identify it. This is how you can think about it. It's digital literacy, basically, that they've been running for more than 10 years, which I think puts them in a box seat in terms of preparing a generation that's going to be facing these increased challenges. And we need to give people information. We need to give them support. There's no doubt about that. We need to think what we can do with industry as much as doing things to industry. We need to really focus, as I say, on education and media literacy. We need to help parents out. I'm a parent, so believe me, I know. Teachers also need support. We're working on this. We've got some material up the front. We've got the pornography survey report. Please do take a copy away. We're really proud of it. Plus also our kind of support guide, which is just a start. It's less about don't watch, just think critically about what you're doing. And to close, this is an example of how we're looking to understand what's going on out there for young people by having a youth advisory panel of a dozen kind of teenagers, basically, 16 to 20 in age, and we meet with them routinely and talk about our strategy, talk about what's happening in their lives, in their world, what will help them, how they think about things to help shape our approach and what we do. And that has been incredibly rich, and it's something we're advocating across the system in terms of every agency that's working in a space that has an impact for young people. Well, talk to them, they'll tell you. You know, increasingly in our space, it's incredible because they're wanting to talk about these things and they so seldom have a safe place where they can do that. So there's enormous power in that. So thank you. It's essentially a collective and challenging job, and we're looking to get everyone involved. So you can play your part as well. Thanks very much.
Do we have any questions?
Questions? Got one here.
Firstly, I'll tell you the bits of what you do I'm comfortable with and actually agree with, which is classification, restrictions on access to materials to people under the age of 18 as a kind of arbitrary kind of age for adulthood. And I have no problem with that. But here's my fundamental question. What right do you have to stop me looking at that manifesto?
So the right that I have to stop you looking at the manifesto is granted under legislation.
I'm not talking about legislation. I'm talking about what right do you, as an individual, have
the moral,
over me?
Yeah, so the moral right, as opposed to the legislative right, comes from what I'd say Karl Popper set out in his work about freedom of expression and the balance of in a society protecting people from harm and giving people the freedom that they need. And so the moral right is every society needs to work out for itself where that balance lies.
But what right do you personally have over me, over whether I can view that manifesto? You personally, because you are making that decision, okay, and you are denying me the right to see something which I believe I have an absolute right to see. So why do you personally, as an individual, because you made the decision, why do you have that right?
I don't personally, individually have the right to stop you.
Well, you do, because you made the decision.
No, let's be clear about this. My personal right is as an officer of the state, operating according to legislation,
Okay,
to
so you've come back
designate
to
material as objectionable, which therefore means if you then choose to access it, and you can still choose to access it, you're running a risk that you'll be prosecuted and
go to
taken
prison.
to prison.
So I don't have a right to access it without going to prison, without being basically put under the force of law and being imprisoned potentially or heavily fined or whatever. So you've gone back to legislation. Well, legislation can pass pretty well anything. So tomorrow, if the government passed legislation, say that it's perfectly acceptable to murder gingerhead babies, would that then give you the right to go and murder gingerhead babies, which is why I said it's about principle. As a principle, what right do you, as a person, have to restrict my access to that material?
Do you think you have a right to possess and access child sexual abuse material?
I knew you'd come to this. I'm not talking about that. That is.
You are talking about that.
No, we're not talking about that at all. It is an entirely different category, and I knew you'd run for the defence behind that. Okay, I'm talking about the right.
Do you think you have a right to own and possess and distribute rape promotional material? So not child sex abuse material,
okay,
but something that is basically deriving satisfaction from rape scenarios. Do you think that's okay?
I think lots of things are not okay and lots of things are very bad. In the case of children, the only way you can make child pornography is to do something with people who essentially cannot be consenting. Therefore, it's perfectly okay to ban it. For the other things, as long as there are consenting adults involved, then as far as I'm concerned, adults have a right to choose. But let's move away from that. And
Do you
I'm
think
asking
the
about your right
victims
to
in the
stop
mosque
me with
were
the manifesto.
consenting people?
Sorry?
Do you think the victims in the mosque were
No,
consenting
we're not talking
adults?
about the victims. We're talking
Oh,
about.
we're talking about all sorts of things.
No, whoa. Let's just keep focused on what I asked you, which is your right to prevent me reading the manifesto. The manifesto.
No, look, I understand the point of view. I'll just round that up. I understand your perspective. In fact, I was having this debate with some senior executives in a major American company recently, going, well, but it's freedom of expression. It's rights. Rights are, the freedom of expression is a core value. And I said to them, look, freedom of expression is a core value. It's under threat now in ways that we've never seen before. And it's what I was saying before. Actually, if you're really serious about protecting freedom of expression, you've got to be really clear about where the boundaries are, who sets them, and what the rules are. Because if you're not clear about that, then, as Popper says, you're needing to tolerate the intolerable, and then basically brutes and dictators and terrorists will use that right against you. No right is absolute.
One moment, without people shouting me down saying I should shut up, okay? There is actually a practical implication.
We have to listen to you.
Yeah.
So what, now do you want to...
Yeah, this is an open forum.
His freedom of speech.
Okay, no. Okay, there's a very practical reason, which is I did read the manifesto before it was banned. One of the most interesting things I found was that the government then actually followed exactly what the guy wanted to happen next, okay, which you will know, and I'd love to be able to quote it, but I can't have a copy, so I can't even quote it to have this discussion. And I think people should be able to evaluate his intentions against...
Dominating the space, move on please, book an appointment. You're dominating the time. We've only got 5 minutes?
Yeah, look, and I would be happy to take it offline and have a discussion, but I understand your point of view, and I guess my take is there's no right and wrong here. I don't think you're right, and I'm not necessarily right. It's about what is the consensus community determination about what's the rules of the game here. Who gets to choose according to what rules? And if you're unhappy with my decision about the manifesto, what you can do, which I don't think you did do, is appeal it to the Board of Review, right? So that's your pathway in a democracy to go, not happy, that sucks, I should have the right, I'm going to work through the process that's actually quite available to me as a free member of a free society to work that through. Hardly anybody did that. Most people just have these debates with me like this, and I'm going, well, there's societies operate according to rules, and there's pathways in a mature society to actually deal with these disputes. And people aren't availing themselves of that, which is a disappointment.
Let's see if we have more questions.
Does it seem a bit random sometimes with your classification, because there's the primacy of someone dying and promotion being explicit, but then as you said at the end, it's all propaganda. A lot of media is propaganda. So, for instance, the rape game for me was really disturbing, and I was thinking, gosh, rather than opening it to the gaming community, that would be really good to open up to the public. Then I bet you get a broader debate that might support a stance for a tougher classification. but there's two questions there, I guess, of is it sometimes your classification seeming a bit random that way, and also do you think there's more scope for opening up some of your decisions to the public to voice their opinion on?
So yes and yes. Yes, classification seems random because it's what I was alluding to before, which is it's a volume issue. We can't classify everything according to our kind of criteria and platform because we're only actually formally classifying about 0.001% of the content that's consumed, right? So that's why right now there's massive confusion and kind of random element. And you've got streaming services who provide a whole range of, I was pointing out the different classification approaches taken internationally. And so you can have streaming services just providing a hodgepodge of all different approaches internationally to classification, or no classification at all. So as a consumer, it's like, what am I looking at here? And that's something we're looking to fix in the near future, to get just increased consistency so consumers have a fighting chance to go, yep, here's, this works, this kind of fits, I'm getting this kind of age rating and warning, and I'm seeing the content, and that makes sense. So that's something we're working towards. In terms of opening up our approach and thinking, that's what we're all about. We can't do enough of that in my view, because it is a balance. It is a negotiation in society about where the line is, particularly when you're making things objectionable and you could go to jail. That's a critical balance point that needs to be understood by the community and agreed to by the community. Yeah. So the more we can have open discussion and dialogue around that and our thinking around that, the better, in my view.
Let's get one more question. Yeah.
Hey, I was just wondering about film age ratings, and specifically about how much of it is the parent's responsibility. For example, like some 15-year-old like myself can't go see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood because it's R16, right? And even though I was with both my parents at the time. So I was just wondering, do you think it's a possibility to have younger kids go see those restricted films if they're with their parents or if their parents consent? Because it seems to me at least part of it is the parents' choice if it's about that age.
So first of all, I'm sorry you couldn't go see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I actually classified that film and I thought it was awesome. So yeah, I'm sorry about that, and I'm also cognizant of the fact that it's going to come out online on iTunes or something in a few weeks, and you'll probably watch it, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So that again kind of highlights the transition phase we are between kind of an 80s view of media and kind of where we're getting to now. So the 80s view of media went, okay, so you're 15, this is R16, you're not going to see it, you're not going to be able to rent it from you're not going to go see it at the movie theatre, you're not going to be able to rent it from a DVD store, and basically we're going to shield you from that until you're 16. And that's just an approach that is increasingly groaning under its own kind of contradictions, which I'm cognizant of. So I think we need to be up for a conversation about maybe thinking about the RP ratings that I mentioned before, and giving parents a greater opportunity to go, actually, my 15-year-old, I've got this, I'm okay with them viewing what is an RP16 classified film. I'm up for that discussion. I'm not saying that's necessarily where we get to, but I'm really keen to have a bit of a, again, negotiated discussion around how people feel about that. The flip side with that approach is you end up with a situation like you have in the US where their R rating is nominally an RP17. So an R rating in the US means that parents can take their kids of any ages to any R-rated film. But if you're under 17, you can't go alone, right? That makes sense. And that can end up with some pretty weird situations where parents take small kids to films like Hostel and stuff like that. So I don't know if that's necessarily where we want to end up, but having some kind of reasonable accommodation for parents to take some some responsibility, and I'm all into the fact that if parents are actually watching stuff that may be challenging with their kids and taking the opportunity to talk to them about it, as opposed to their kids just consuming it themselves alone, and trying to deal with it alone, that's, having that opportunity for children and parents and guardians to have dialogue about stuff that's challenging is, I think, what we've got to encourage as well.
Just a really quick follow-up.
Yep.
How would that be changed? Is that something you can do yourself, or would that have to be legislatively done?
I think, technically, I could just say, you know what, I'm just going to start rating everything in RP. So technically, I could make it, but if I did do that, I would be instantly into a pretty hot political debate, because everyone would be seeing what I was doing was essentially making a policy change without a mandate, right? So I think we need a mandate. We need to have that conversation, if that makes sense.
Sorry. Just wondering about with the live streaming services, how do you deal with that? Did Facebook ever give an answer on how you supposed to classify something that's live and stop it from people seeing?
So that's really, really hard. But if anyone can crack it, an outfit like Facebook that made 70+ billion profit last year, was it? I might be making that up, but it was a lot, right? And they've announced also the fact that basically it comes down to digital challenge, digital solution, as I mentioned before, right? This is a digital platform challenge that could be amenable to digital solutions, and ultimately that means AI and image recognition software. And what Facebook announced just last week, I think it was, is they're actually using military footage and military training footage to provide a bigger cache of inputs to train their AIs. So their AIs can basically distinguish between something like a live stream terrorist attack and a first-person shooter game upload, which is not a trivial thing, but actually I reasonably believe they're making progress in that direction. So I think that provides at least some of the solution.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing your time and listening, as well as for this conversation.
Very welcome. Thank you.